Welcome to the Mick Dark Horror Series. Lights out. Good. Here we go.
There are things out there in the world that feed on human sadness and regret. When those things feast upon someone's grief, they take ownership of that person's soul. They wander the earth and gather the souls of the damned for their own wicked ends. Certain times of the year, those collectors of souls wield more power and gorge more than ever themselves on human misery. It's right around Christmas. They seem to be the strongest. You see, for many people, the holiday season can be a very difficult time. Feelings of loneliness weigh heavy on the hearts of some, while others are haunted by thoughts of their perceived failures as they try to look back on all they have accomplished throughout the year. Tom was one of those warriors that continuously battled the seasonal anguish. One year, it almost claimed him. Tom's was a soul drinking from a cocktail of loneliness and regret, with a splash of failure, and of course, some bourbon. Tom was working the midnight shift at the Pump and Go gas station at the edge of town that Christmas Eve. He stared despondently out the window toward the long stretch of empty highway that ran along the front of the gas station as a light snow began to fall. The overhead lights flickered at random. Tom's eyes were bloodshot, and gin blossoms brightened the tip of his nose. His shirt was stained and wrinkled. Tom sat with his feet up on the counter as he sat reclining in this chair, listening to some voicemails on his cell phone.
"Thomas, this is an urgent business matter,"
snapped the voice of a bill collector, before Tom angrily skipped past.
"Tom, it's Steven. Look, man, you're 30 days late with the rent again. If you don't have it in the morning, you have to go. I hope you understand. It's just business,"
said Tom's roommate Steven reluctantly. Once again, Tom furiously mashed the next button on the screen and skips to the subsequent message. Tom's agent, or former agent, I guess, was the next to pile on in his usual condescending slickster tone with,
"Yo, Tommy, buddy, Chip here. Hey, I got the demo over to some friends of mine at the label. They dig it, but said after the meltdown you had at the Albuquerque show, you're just too much of a liability. Sorry, buddy. I don't know. Maybe get your shit together, huh? If not, it might be time to hang it up. Anyway, call me back, buddy."
Tom's mood danced between furious and utterly heartbroken. He pulled up an MP3 file of this latest demo and begrudgingly pressed play. A somber rock melody began to play, but was interrupted by his phone's vibration. And the mocking chirp of a new notification. Tom was absolutely devastated by the continued barrage of horrible news and blurted out, "What? What the fuck else could possibly go wrong?" in a moment of pure frustration. When he did finally open his phone to check it, he was greeted by the photo of a pretty young woman dressed in elegant evening wear in the arms of a handsome man in a suit tagged at a bar in town. "Bailey? You have to be kidding me. You cheating slut," Tom whimpered, completely devastated by the sight of his girlfriend in the photo with another man at some party on Christmas Eve. Sheer hopelessness and despair overtook him, and he threw his phone to the counter, only to watch it bounce and clatter to the floor, shattering its screen. Outside of the store, a group of dirty raccoons wandered across the gas station parking lot. They seemed to like to torment him regularly. The largest of them knocked over a trash can, plastic bottles and other trash scattered. Some papers caught on a breeze spread the mess thoroughly across the lot. The raccoons rummaged in the garbage for a bit, making a complete mess. The largest of them, presumably the leader, gnawed on part of a leftover hot dog. The overhead lights flickered off and on a few more times. Snow began to fall in sticky, thick, wet clumps that stuck to the beast's fur. Tom noticed the raccoons in the trash through the front window and sprang into action. He leapt over the counter and burst through the front door of the gas station in an attempt to scare the gang of raccoons off. They appeared to be unfazed by this dramatic production. Tom tried again. He stomped his foot forward towards them and clapped his hands. Still nothing. When Tom took a few more loud steps towards them, the large one only glanced in Tom's direction for a moment before returning to his snack. Tom decided then that he had had enough of that nonsense. He pulled out a small bottle of whiskey from his pocket. The leader of the raccoon gang took notice and eyed Tom cautiously before giving a snarl and a short hiss. Tom downed the last swallow of the bitter brown liquid in the bottle before heaving it in their direction. The hard plastic bottle clanked and rattled as it bounced towards the raccoons on the pavement. It bounced once more and glanced off the smallest in the gang, and they scattered into the darkness.
"Fucking trash pandas!"
Tom exclaimed. A triumphant smirk stretched across his face at the idea that perhaps things might still be all right after all. He lit up a smoke and stared out at the night. A single car drove by without slowing down, and the glow of its taillights slowly faded into the night. Tom was alone with his thoughts again. He turned to walk back into the store, but tripped over his crappy old, rusted-out bicycle that had been leaning against the wall by the front doors. In a fit of profanity-laced frustration, he grabbed the bike and flung it across the lot. It came to rest in the bushes near the edge of the gas station's property. Not a bad distance, Tom thought to himself.
I could be an Olympian yet,
Tom declared with a chuckle before returning inside. Once inside, he shuddered and quickly rubbed his arms in an attempt to warm himself after his trip into the biting cold of the night. Tom walked over, grabbed a soda from the cooler and a bag of chips from a display just left of the cooler. He tossed the chips on the counter and took his place back on the pump-and-go throne behind the register. Tom grabbed a small duct tape remote from under the counter, flipped on the crummy little black and white TV that sat next to the register. It suddenly began to flip through the channels all on its own, getting faster and faster. Bursts of images and static flipped by until sparks flew from the back. The screen went dark, and tendrils of smoke rose from the set. Tom recoiled in shock. The clock on the wall read 2:30 a.m. "Last call," Tom announced to himself through his crooked grin. He snagged another of the small bottles from behind the counter, mixed it into his soda, and gulped it down in one long, deep swallow. Tom thought for a bit about the sadness of his convenience store cocktail as he looked at his broken phone and sighed. Thoughts of all that had been going on in his life played on an endless loop in his mind, eventually landing on repeats of his failures and how everything had gone so wrong. In a moment of weakness, Tom began to question what the point was anymore. He picked up a box cutter from the counter next to the TV and slowly slid out the blade. It glinted in the blinking fluorescent light. Tom held the blade in his trembling hands for a moment before bringing it to his wrist and pressing it into his soft flesh. A diminutive trickle of blood ran down his arm. He watched as the flow of blood increased and made a trail down his forearm to his elbow. A few droplets fell to the floor. Tom moved his arm and let a few more drops splatter to the ground, making a crude smiley face. The door chime rang, and Tom dropped the blade. Awkwardly, Tom turned to greet the customer in a mix of embarrassment and frustration at being interrupted at that most painful private moment in his life. A stranger in a fine tailored black suit, wearing sunglasses and dark black hair slicked back, stood in the doorway. Tom thought it odd that the man was wearing sunglasses in a snowstorm at night, but offered a weak greeting.
Good evening, dude. Merry Christmas. How can I help you?
Tom said weakly. The stranger stood motionless just inside the doorway. The door chime rang again. This time, it was different, though. It rang slowly, and the pitch was stretched out in a long, eerie moan. The stranger cocked his head from side to side. His neck cracked as it did so, and he continued to size Tom up.
You break down or something? I don't see a car out there.
Tom questioned, trying to hold back the fear in his voice.
You want me to call for a tow?
He continued with a quiver. Somehow, maybe while Tom blinked, the stranger had made his way to the counter, just in front of Tom. The stranger again stood motionless, staring coldly at Tom. Tom snatched his cell phone from the counter and frantically began to try and dial for help, before remembering that he had shattered his phone earlier that night.
Don't worry, Tom. I am just here to show you.
The stranger hissed in a deep and distorted whisper. His lips did not move and were pressed tightly in a neat line. Tom dropped the phone in a panic and tried to back away, only to slam into the wall display behind him, sending various merchandise crashing to the floor. The stranger remained unfazed, calm, and still.
Show me what?
Tom questioned.
How do you know my name? Who are you?
He continued in a shaky voice.
Is this what you wanted to do with your life, Tom?
The stranger mocked in response, completely ignoring Tom's pleas for answers. The stranger stood silently, awaiting Tom's reply.
You need to leave. Like right fucking now, man. I have a gun.
Tom barked, feigning authority but still lacking any sort of confidence to back it up. The stranger gleamed an evil smile, exposing a mouth full of decaying pointed teeth that shook Tom to his core.
No. No, you do not, Tom. If you did, you would have already used it.
The stranger countered knowingly. Tom's back was firmly pressed against the wall as if he were trying to push right through it to escape. The stranger dipped his head and removed his sunglasses to reveal eyes as black as night. There was no glimmer in the stranger's eyes. They seemed to almost absorb all light rather than allow for any glint of reflection. Tom's eyes went wide with terror as the stranger continued.
Tell me, Tom, is this what you wanted to do with your life?
The stranger hissed. Tom and the stranger locked eyes. The music that was playing on the shitty clock radio behind the counter began to whiz by in fast forward. Songs and commercials sped by in one tangled string of melody, static, and haunting twisted voices. Still images of Tom's failures began to play in his mind, flipping by like the faded frames of an old home movie. Pictures of Tom on stage in front of a massive cheering crowd were followed by the spectacle of Tom in a drunken stupor, beating a fan on stage. Tom seemed to laugh maniacally as he beat the man before pouring liquor on him as he lay beaten and bleeding on the stage. That scene faded and gave way to one of a hotel room that had been destroyed, eventually settling in on Tom passed out in a pool of his own vomit on the hotel room floor. Next, the stranger showed him the scene of a horrific accident. Tom was slumped passed out, drunk with barely a scratch, behind the wheel of his car. The banged-up body of his drummer, Chris, was visible to him through the broken windshield, as he lay with a vacant look in his eyes, unmoving on the pavement in front of the wrecked car.
Is this who you wanted to be?
The stranger asked, tauntingly before continuing.
What happened, Tom? I can free you. No more pain. Tom,
The whistling of a familiar slow, sad melody could be heard softly as the stranger spoke.
Finish what you started with that blade, Tom.
The stranger challenged. Tom's eyes rolled back into his head, and he collapsed in a heap on the floor behind the counter. Moments later, Tom awoke shaken and confused. He figured he must have nodded off and fell out of his chair, but was glad to have been pulled from that horrible nightmare. Tom cracked another bottle of cheap whiskey. He shook his head and tried to gather himself for a moment before downing another of the tiny bottles. Tom tried to get his mind off the whole ordeal, pulled a dirty magazine from the rack behind the counter. He carefully removed it from its plastic with the tender touching grace of someone examining a priceless artifact. The lights of the gas station flashed and sparked, both inside and out, before going out completely. It remained dark for a second and the lights reluctantly flickered back on.
I swear this fucking dump is gonna burn to the ground one of these days, and I'm just gonna laugh. Cheap-ass bastards.
He muttered under his breath. Tom plopped back down in his chair and kicked up his feet once again. Then he slowly thumbed through the pages of the adult magazine, stopping on the centerfold for a minute. He rotated the magazine and cocked his head to the side in an attempt to take in the full beauty of the stunning centerfold model.
Hello, nurse.
Tom exclaimed with a wide grin. He gave a short glance toward the restroom at the back of the store, and then back at the centerfold. Tom changed his mind after reading the model's turn-ons and turn-offs page, which read, "My biggest turn-ons are a man with a good sense of humor, creativity, intelligence, and most importantly, ambition." The turn-offs read like a checklist of all Tom's failings: laziness, complacency, anger. Tom slumped back in his chair, defeated by the thought that even in his fantasies, he was not good enough. As he contemplated all that had gone wrong and his mind began to wander, his depression and sadness wrapped him like a warm, safe blanket. The moment was shattered by the sound of someone whistling the slow, sad melody of Tom's latest demo. Tom fell back, knocking everything from a display and sending items scattering across the floor. The stranger reveled in Tom's fear and despair. The whistling of the song began to grow louder and louder. Finally, Tom clapped his hands over his ears, trying to drown out the deafening tune.
What the hell's going on?
Tom shouted as he held his hands tightly over his ears. Tom looked out the front window. A look of pure horror washed over his face. He fell to the ground, clumsily tried to crawl away through the merchandise strewn across the floor. A massive army of mutilated ghouls had begun to gather outside the store. They slowly made their way towards Tom and pressed themselves against the window as if they were trying to walk right through them. Each one of them showed their own telling tale. A rope hung from the twisted, limp neck of a pale woman. A man walked in a stiff, jerking motion, bouncing off the window like a moth to a porch light. Blood and foam frothed on his lips and oozed down to his chin. Another man, with his jaw hanging slack, seemed to lock eyes with Tom. He turned to reveal a gaping gunshot wound to the side of his head. The lights once again flickered and went out. A disembodied voice taunted from the darkness. Tom struggled to regain his vision in the dark. When he could see clearly again, he found himself no longer inside the store behind the counter, but standing alone in the alleyway behind the gas station. He turned to run back into the store, only to find his own lifeless body slumped on the ground in a pool of blood. The box cutter was gripped tightly in his hand, and both of his wrists sliced deeply. The gang of raccoons he had battled so valiantly earlier had returned and were now ripping at the flesh around Tom's wounds. The stranger once again whistled the tune, and Tom watched as his body rose to stand. A tear rolled down Tom's cheek as he watched himself walk off into the darkness behind the stranger. When the lights flashed back on and the lot was empty, snow once again fell gingerly from the sky and landed softly upon the ground. Tom shivered from the cold, and his world went dark. When Tom awoke, he was again in the chair behind the counter. But the sun had begun to rise. A few empty liquor bottles were scattered around the register. His heart pounded heavily when he spotted the stranger's sunglasses among the empty plastic bottles. Tom jumped when the door chime rang. He struggled to calm himself and muster the courage to look up to see who had entered. Tom was relieved to see it was only his goody-two-shoes co-worker, Anna, coming in to start her shift. Anna looked down at the bottles distributed across the counter and shook her head. Tom jumped out of his chair, trying to quickly swipe the bottles off the counter. They all clattered to the floor and made an even bigger mess. Anna scoffed and rolled her eyes.
Sorry, long night. You startled me is all.
Tom belated sheepishly. As Tom stared at Anna, her lips began to move, but the voice that spoke was not her own. The voice of the stranger took its place.
What are you going to do with your life, Tom?
It boomed. The memories of the images the stranger had showed him played over and over in his mind. Tom stood frozen in fear. He finally managed to gather himself and ask with a stutter.
What? What did you just say?
Anna gave Tom a look of concern and repeated herself.
I said, what do you have planned for your day off, silly?
Tom, still troubled and confused, stood and brushed himself off before responding.
I gotta get a life, man. Maybe quit drinking and maybe more of an effort with my music. I think if I don't, I might just die.
Tom blurted out. Anna looked at him confused and Tom continued.
Now, if you'll excuse me, I got a demo to push and some assholes to prove wrong.
Tom pushed past Anna on his way out the door. She noticed the sunglasses still laying on the counter and called out after him.
Tom, wait, your sunglasses. Keep 'em.
Tom replied while walking briskly to his bike, still laying in the bush on the edge of the lot where he had thrown it earlier. He clumsily mounted the rusted junk heap and shakily began to pedal off. The chain broke and the bike seized up. Tom nearly fell as he hopped off the bike. He dropped that damn bike right where he was, and he smiled before turning and continuing to walk joyfully along the highway towards town. He jammed his hands into his jacket pockets to warm them and felt the sting of a paper cut. Tom slowly retrieved the offending item. It was a business card for an A&R rep with a major label. On the back, in scribbled handwriting, it read, "Call me." A wide smile stretched across Tom's face. In the other direction, the stranger walked along the highway, whistling his slow, sad song. His army of the damned followed behind him. Tom turned to look back and reflect on the enormity of it all. The highway was empty. The stranger and his army had vanished. About a year later, Tom returned to the Pump and Go. His shitty rusted bike had been replaced by a beautiful custom Harley. A scantily clad woman was perched on the back with her arms wrapped tightly around Tom's waist. As he climbed off the bike and removed his helmet, he appeared changed. He was a happier, more confident man. It was the sort of confidence and swagger that comes with success. The woman on the back? Well, I shit you not. She was none other than the centerfold from the magazine.
Hey, babe, could you get me some gum?
She called out as Tom walked towards the door.
You got it, babe.
Tom replied with a smile and headed inside. He grabbed the pack of gum from the display on the counter and slapped it down.
Just this and 15 on pump 2.
Tom chirped.
Tom? Is that you?
The woman behind the counter inquired. Tom looked up to see his cheating ex-girlfriend, no longer the vision of beauty she had been just a year ago. She stood weary and disheveled behind the counter with a forced smile plastered on her face.
Nope, I'm sorry. I think you got the wrong guy, Bailey.
Tom replied with a twisted smile as he headed back to his new life. The stranger stood at the edge of the lot and stared in at Bailey. A wicked and unnatural grin cracked across his face before he pursed his lips together and once again whistled his slow, sad tune. A tear rolled down Bailey's cheek as she stared out the window and then glanced down at the box cutter next to the register.